Hi all, I have another amazing game of Magnus Carlsen in one of my favourite openings with the black pieces, the Sicilian Sveshnikov. This is against John Smeets in the Chorus B 2006 tournament, which Magnus actually tied for first eventually and then qualified for Chorus A as a result. So this was a great tournament for Magnus overall. Let's see what happened in this particular game. E4 from John Smeets. We have C5, Knight F3, Knight C6. So this is the standard move order for getting into the Sicilian Sveshnikov. So black plays here Knight F6. So committing white to Knight C3. This is, in my view, much stronger than E5. That's a relative continuation. Learnful, Kalashnikov. Different names for that. But Knight F6 commits white to block that C pawn. So there's less chance of a Maroczy bind. E5. Knight DB5, D6, Bishop G5, A6, Knight A3, B5. So black is now threatening B4. White usually either plays Bishop takes here or Knight D5. In this game, we see Knight D5, Bishop E7, Bishop takes F6, Bishop takes F6, C3. So usually, based on the structure, white is often rerouting this knight to influence the d5 square. That's one common route, and another might be, depending on circumstances, via b4 to support this d5 knight. Whilst doing that, often white is considering a move like a4 to structurally also undermine black's little queenside pawn island. Black has their trump cards as well, though. The bishop pair is one particular one, especially this dark square bishop without the counterpart is one of the most interesting if that can be creatively used. So watch out for this one in particular. We see it actually preserved immediately with bishop g5. Black could castle and delay. White really doesn't want to lose that knight in a hurry usually, so this has been seen before where it's permitted to delay if it wants to go to g5. This kind of situation has been seen before, with dynamic chances for both sides. But bishop g5 immediately, knight c2. Now knight e7, and in fact now the c knight goes to b4. Now that this is not looking at b4, this avoids the possibility of giving black the option sometimes of bishop takes e3 if the knight had gone this route. So it's quite interesting. Just as an example, knight ce3, black doesn't have to take that immediately, say castling, but now say waiting for a move like g3, maybe this is a moment black could take on e3 and play bishop b7, and it should be quite an interesting position to play for both sides. So anyway, knight cb4 rules out that possibility of bishop takes e3, black castles, and now a4. So white's keeping a bind on that d5 square, trying to fracture black further on the queen side. B takes, rook takes a4, and there's really a threat to this pawn potentially. In fact, the b4 knight has the other perk. It's putting pressure on a6 here as well. That's actually another significant perk rather than being on e3. It plays quite an aggressive role here. If instead of rook takes a4, queen takes a5, this position is quite interesting, and it should be about even. The black queen could use a7, f5. There's still a target on f2, which is interesting. In fact, there's a Magnus Carlsen stem game around here with bishop b5. This occurred in a game of Gasikamsky, believe it or not, against Magnus Carlsen in 2005, the year before. And let's have a quick look at that. Knight takes, bishop e6. Black actually did seem to get a reasonable position. And around here, after b4, it seems technically black would have been absolutely fine, instead of king h8, just to take on b4 and then play f5. Slight difference, but it makes black absolutely fine. If black gives up on the bishop, sometimes that's fine, opposite colour bishops, and that should be a pretty stable position. Instead, in that stem game, we have actually queen a6, which asked for b5. Maybe a bit provocative here, because then d6 was under scrutiny, and in fact taking here, hitting the f8 rook, this actually created a big advantage for white in the game continuation. In fact, yes, f7 was a problem, and it looks as though the whole thing was rather tricky, especially after dropping f7 and b6. That was it. So, but there was definitely a route there to equalise, dissolving on b4 in that stem game. But anyway, we don't have any of that here. We don't have queen takes a4. It is interesting, queen takes a4. We have rook takes a4, a5, f5. Here we can see actually that it's possible for white to just go for that pawn with rook takes a6. Yeah, the knight is playing a role to hold on to the extra material here without any backfire. White can come back and consolidate to a large extent like that. Bishop d3 to e4, holding up d5 again. So there's no real compensation there for black. So it's important to actually protect this pawn with a5. It seems knight takes, queen takes. We have bishop c4. You might ask, what about knight d5 immediately? On knight d5 immediately, it seems as though queen b7 is a good parking spot for the queen, looking at b2, and still, exerting some pressure on d5 to make f5 a little bit more effective, trying to undermine white's grip on d5. So, say b4, bishop d7. This position, even if a temporary pawn sack happens, there's a lot of activity for black, and black could get behind the pawn and win that even position. And here, if bishop c4, it's possible for black to take that. That's not exactly a poisoned pawn. That's fine. Black's doing very well there, small advantage. So bishop c4, exploiting the fact that pawn's pinned. Bishop d7, unpinning, threatening pawn takes knight, threatening bishop takes. But we have knight d5 hitting the queen. The queen actually steps rather interestingly to e8. Not going back to d8. The d8 parking spot is very important for this dark square bishop. Throughout this game, this bishop is a real treasure, really. It's got to be treasured, and it's got to be made use of, sometimes on both sides of the board, if needed. In the King's Engine, the dark square bishop often comes to a key diagonal in the King's Engine defense, in some variations, or tries to get onto that diagonal via e3 sometimes and go back on this diagonal. So sometimes that bishop is an important piece in the King's Engine defense. Now here we see d8 being reserved for it. Rook a2, knight c7 is impossible because actually bishop takes a4 is hitting white's queen. So that's a big advantage to black, winning material there. So no time for that. So rook a2, and now this gives the time for the bishop to protect c7 and b6 as well. And a5. So the bishop's doing a really nice job here on this side of the board at the moment. Solid. The bishops together, huddled together like this. White castles. Rook c8. That bishop is moved to protect it. Rook b8. Queen c2. King h8. So preparing f5. So you can see a target on the dark square f2, and that might be a more meaningful target if this bishop joins on the diagonal. We see rook fa1. This might not be the most optimal move. It is interesting. Positionally, white was intuitively perhaps interested in a light square bishop exchange to leave black strategically vulnerable, especially with that huge knight on d5. That would be a classic strategy. The huge knight versus the dark square bishop. If only this bishop could be exchanged off. So there's a tactic here preventing bishop a4 immediately, just taking. And if queen takes, we just take and then take on b2. If rook takes b2. Let's look at that. So because of that b file pressure, this isn't possible. Rook takes b2 as an example. And then queen takes a4. So the tactical justification to try and play for bishop a4, to exchange off this bishop, to make this knight huge, it's lucrative. But black has counterplay here. f5 is played. And we see white going ahead with bishop a4. On e takes f5, instead, bishop takes this position. Black's doing very nicely with queen g6, introducing the bishop on this diagonal. That's where the bishop really wants to be, with f2 as a target. If the knight really has to retreat, Black's in the driving seat there with a small edge. So we see bishop a4. So this is the classic, nightmare that's at some point put me off the Sveshnikov. There was a period of time I was fed up of huge knights on d5. So this is one of the strategies to really make Black fed up. Just exchange off the light square bishop, so there's no chance of taking on d5 later, to have a dominating position. The thing is, here, now, there's bishop takes a4, rook takes, and there's a tactic, f takes e4, believe it or not. And in fact, the knight is now a loose piece, and that could be tapped into. This is a dreadful loose piece liability, in fact. White plays rook 4 to a2, because if rook takes e4, can you see what Black plays in this position? If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Okay. Queen b5. Yes, the b file pressure is meaningful. Also the f file pressure sometimes. But here, it's hitting, the queen is hitting d5 and b2 with that battery. So say queen e1, just taking on b2. And Black has very good play here, taking out that pawn. This outside pass pawn, even though it's a huge knight on d5, there's a target on f2, for example. Black's generally doing nicely there overall. So we have rook 4 to a2, queen f7, c4. So White really needs to make this knight stable. If the knight goes back, this is asking for huge trouble with d5. For example, rook d1 would leave this one loose, so d4 hits the knight and hits a2. So don't want trouble scenarios like that to make things worse. So the knight is just perched on d5 and supported here. White wants to try and maybe use the second rank to protect f2 and then take on e4. That looks to be the general plan. But Black puts an immediate spanner in the works here for literally b3 even being played legally. So can you guess what Black plays in this position? If I give you 5 seconds here. So White will want to play a move like b3 or b4 to protect indirectly f2. So that queen takes e4 is played. So that makes the knight look fantastic compared to the bishop. But Black here plays, so 100 points. Can you guess? Okay, spectacular looking move. Rook b3. Yes, the queen is a bit overloaded here. So blockades the pawn. If queen takes b3, then queen takes f2 is mating with the classic back row checkmate. So here, White plays rook e1. And now, Magnus creates a nice square for this rook over on this side of the board with its fellow heavy gun artillery. Can you see the provocative move that Black uses to create a square for this rook? That's your mission if you choose to accept. What does Black play here? Very instructive moves here for the attacking player. Okay, bishop h4. So trying to nudge g3 to give f3 for that rook. White obliged with g3. It turns out here, this might be a mistake actually, because rook e2 might actually be the way to go on e3, f3, and accept the visual nastiness of bishop f2, because there might not be an immediately easy continuation coming up here. This scenario looks as though White could get away with sacking the queen on rook b2 for 2 rooks. And yeah, it looks well, also the back row, sorry, it's not even that. There's a potential back row liability of rook a8. So say this scenario where the king's now been given some air. It turns out here, this continuation, it turns out it could be actually a lot of resilience in White's position. For example here, we get this position which is even. So this was a critical moment, it turns out, in the game, where rook e2 seems to offer White a survival prospect by accepting this horrible looking position. Rook takes e3, by the way, then just bishop takes f2. that's a disaster. So there's only, it seems this is the way to go though, rook e2, not giving that f3 square. But g3 gave that f3 square, and black ignores the bishop being attacked and just plays rook f3, trebling, because the might of rook takes f2 compensates if the bishop's taken. We see b3 protecting f2 again. If g takes h4, rook takes f2, this is really devastating. So say queen takes, rook f1 check, queen f2, it's all pretty forcing. The rook 8 to f3, queen g2 check, and this is just mating. So pretty much a disaster. If the bishop is taken, that would be a poisoned bishop on h4. And if we look at this variation again, instead of king g2, if rook takes, then there's just queen takes mate. So not too much choices there. So b3, can't take this bishop. And the bishop goes back to d8. So it's nice that black's coordinated via b3 the rook with the other heavy pieces here. We have rook takes e4. So is white satisfied though? Because white has actually got that scenario with a seemingly powerful knight on d5. What could possibly go wrong here? The thing is, some damage has been done provoking this g3. This is actually a useful pawn chain, all on dart squares, and we have a dart square bishop here. So Magnus is super creative and resourceful to maximize the potential of what basically is the bishop without the counterpart. This is a huge theme recently in neural networks that we've seen in some games of Stoffles, the bishop without a counterpart. Black really wants to exploit this asset. So it's more than I consider the classic Silman imbalance. It's the imbalance the opponent can never really have. So what can you do with it in this position? We see a super aggressive move, black to play, try and do something with this bishop, with this pawn chain. What would you play? If I give you 5 seconds here. Okay, h5, yes, trying to mine this pawn chain on dark squares, weaken these dark squares a bit further. We have rook e2 being played. So you might ask, see, one prospect is h4 is already supported by the bishop. You might ask, well, what about h4? It turns out here the bishop can also support the energetic g5. So this position where h4 is becoming possible to further undermine, tear to shreds this kingside pawn chain. If their rook takes b3 is the most clear. In fact, a change of tact there if that's left unprotected. Because here, if h4, it turns out there's an interruption tactic, knight f4 on that rook, so that's a bit loose as well, that rook. So this position is actually is not going to be that easy, this scenario. So the way to play this, it turns out, is just take that pawn if it's left unprotected. So it's not liability in its own right, that rook. So yeah, you can change tact on this plan of undermining the pawn chain because of these certain liabilities. So rook e2 was played though, not h4, inviting this g5. We have h4, and now of course there's the potential form pawn. If the pawn ends up on h3, there's that, but the undermining aspect is particularly critical here, not using it as a form pawn, because we really want this bishop to be having a great time trying to destroy the rest of the pawn chain sometimes. Two major options though. Rook b2, we see another fantastic move here, which is key for black's attacking potential, and it's quite subtle actually. I wonder if you can guess it. If I give you 5 seconds here, black to play a move quite subtle to bring further attacking options into the position later via the h file, if I give you that a clue. Okay, the king's engine move g6. We'd want the king's engine, the fianchetto, the bishop. So it's as if we're coming from a king's engine in reverse engineering this to get those king's engine possibilities of rook h8. The king being able to move out of the way for rook h8 sometimes. So king g2 was played. On b4, as an example here, hg. Believe it or not, rook takes g3 becomes totally possible, viable, because of check and this nifty king g7, making room for rook h8 mating. And there's very little white could do, because this dark square bishop is playing a crucial role here, guarding h4. So the attempt, rook e4, fails, just check, and then the bishop can snap that up. The attack continues and leading to checkmate. So very, very interesting that b4. Let's just look at that again. HG. So that's this devastating. Instead of b4, let's look at rook e1 as well as an alternative. King g7, rook a2. Here, queen a7 is nifty, pinning that pawn. So, for example, here, just to see the pin can be used with rook takes g3. That's what white's up against sometimes as well. This queen a7 mechanism to pin that pawn. Let's have a quick peek at this rook e1 again. And here, instead of asking for it, rook b2, let's unpin. Rook takes f2. Here, h3 check is possible. So the king has to stay around f2. And now rook takes f2 and queen d4. And this is actually crushing with that form pawn. This is a form pawn scenario, which black is winning further material and now has this passed outside a pawn. The bishop's running rampant potentially on this diagonal. That's over for white. White cannot coordinate this position with the rooks. So very, very interesting scenario. And if we look at that again with king g1, yeah, again, similar scenario. It doesn't make too much difference. Black punches the pawn chain over here, undermining that knight, which loosens b6 control, which means the bishop is going to be vicious on this diagonal. It's come out with a vengeance and win material, for example, like that. So there's a lot of interesting scenarios here. You know, just to put them on the board with b4 and rook e1 there, which all seem to favour black. Rook b1, I'm not sure we looked at this one though. Rook b1, just for the record, h3. Look at this form pawn scenario. So because form pawns are a lot of fun, let's have a look at this one. With king g7, bishop g5. The king tucking away safely. You can do this. If you've got the dark square bishop, you can put your king on the same colour and tuck the king safely. Let's use this pin for a moment. And imagine a scenario where black even just gets the queens off here. This scenario is actually quite favourable, potentially. That's a dangerous pass pawn. And yeah, things are getting very interesting here for black, actually, technically. This endgame is just very enjoyable for black to play, as an example. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. But king g2 was played. We have HG, and now guess what Magnus plays here, if I give you 5 seconds to pause the video. Black to play. So we're back to the main game, just to be clear on that. So black playing here plays rook takes g3. Yes, this idea of king g7, rook h8 is a very valuable resource. King f1 was played. So if we have king takes g3, check, and then king g7 making way for rook h8 is still going to be mating here for rook h1 being threatened. White would have to give up loads of material with spike checks and still get mated. On f takes g3, by the way, check, and then king g7. Again, same pattern. Rook h8 is decisive. King h2, slight different variation. Rook h3 check, and then king g7. This is a key move in a lot of these variations, with the rook coming to use that h file. So yes, this is horrible for white after rook takes g3. The tactics seems to have, they haven't been contained. Black's undermining strategy has led to this very nice tactical situation now. So any notions of this knight being better than bishop is now outweighed. Black is actually material up, and there's king safety issues that have crept in. Queen f3, threatening mating one with queen h1. White indirectly defends that with queen e4, looking at h1. If king e1, then check, bishop g5 check. This is just black running rampant with white's king safety. It's devastating stuff. Yeah, it's horrible. So queen e4, we have queen h5, knight e3. On king e1, as an example, rook g4 is a nice tempo gain. And here, rook d4 actually is not just a tempo gain, it's also cutting escape squares, so to make this check more effective. So, for example, queen c2, queen h1 is now checkmate. So, knight e3 is played, bishop g5. So, horrible pressure here on white. King e1, rook gf3. There are different ways of playing this. Rook h3 is also strong here. As an example, rook h3, this is an example continuation where black can stop any queen h8 with bishop f6 and then pin that knight on f1 and then get these kind of devastating scenarios where the king is too weak. For example, like this, I know I was messing about there, but then just winning that rook, cashing out like that. Okay, so rook gf3 is also strong though, knight f1. Bishop c1, and this gives the idea actually that this bishop's really going to run rampant, having a good time on the dark squares. If it can do that and control escape squares and the king has to move, then a move like queen h1 is more devastating than usual, pinning the knight. So these are horrible implications, bishop a3 to b4, as well as where the bishop is already, it's usefully cutting a king escape square. We have rook a2. If rook bc2, as an example, bishop a3, this situation, as well as just pinning the rook, we can pin the knight first, and here it's just horrible. This situation, we're threatening now rook e4, and it's difficult for white. White's tied up in knots here, because if rook e2, there's bishop b4 check, and if king d1, queen takes f1, and so there's rook e4. It's very difficult to actually parry. It's just winning the queen. So very, very tricky scenarios here after bishop a3. If king d1, this situation, some spike checks, we can play bishop b4 and then simply queen h1, and the bishop's doing a fine job dividing the king from the knight. White would have to give up the exchange. It's hopeless. So yes, rook a2, try and stop this bishop a3 to b4. But that drops the b3 pawn. It is taken here. Knight g3, queen h6, keeping some very interesting possibilities alive. And white here plays queen g4. Black plays a move and it's the end of the game here. I wonder if you can see what black played here to finish the game. If I give you 5 seconds to pause the video here. So the clue, there is a devastating weakness of the last move. That queen was protecting h1. Okay, I hope you found this. Rook takes g3. The queen's going to go to h1 with a checkmate here. It's not supported by the queen on e4 anymore. So if the game continued, white had to resign. If queen takes, then here is mating. Yeah. If fg, queen h1, checkmate. The bishop is controlling escape squares. d2. Yeah, this was a very bad situation to be in before the queen g4 move. Yeah, there's a lot of trouble here. The queen itself is often a big tempo gainer. It's very, very tricky to play. Okay, a wonderful game, I thought. Another wonderful example. So in 2006, this chorus B, used in a couple of games. This was one of the key games that was used with the black pieces to generate serious winning chances and counterplay with black, not just being contented with a draw. So Magnus was really in fighting spirit. The fighting cap of Magnus was put on in these games with the Sicilian Sveshnikov. If you want to learn more about Sicilian defense by Magnus Carlsen, there's a fantastic interactive course. We can get a free lesson at Kingscrusher TV/Magnus at the moment, done by the amazing Chess Explained, who's very, very conscientiously going over a lot of the fine resources, finesses, ideas, plans, tactics in positions to train on for free. So check that out, Kingscrusher TV/Magnus. The Sveshnikov has become super popular again since Magnus's revisit of it during the World Championship matches. So it's been elevated as a serious weapon of choice for the player with the black pieces wanting to play for a win, wanting to fight. Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks very much.